The careful arrangement of fabric, bolts, and sewing supplies had replaced the frenetic energy of backstage preparation for Paris Fashion Week 25 years ago, but Margot Beaumont, still moved through the craft store with the artistic vision and meticulous attention to detail that had once made her one of the most innovative avant-garde fashion designers in the world. Margot, 66, sat in the second row of the Tonight Show studio, her designer's trained eye automatically analyzing the costume choices and fabric textures, while her seamstress hands moved in unconscious pattern-cutting motions on her lap. The small Creative Corner Crafts 25-year service badge on her simple cardigan caught the studio lights as she adjusted her vintage eyeglasses with the precise movements of someone who had spent decades working with the finest fabrics and most delicate construction techniques. To the hundreds of customers who had sought Margot's advice on sewing projects over 2.5 decades, she was just another knowledgeable craft store employee who somehow understood fabric like a scientist and could envision how any material would drape, fold, and move before it was ever cut. What they didn't know was that their quilting supplies and home sewing projects were being guided by a woman who had dressed supermodels for Vogue covers and created collections that had redefined the boundaries between fashion and wearable art. What Margot didn't know was that her story had been quietly circulating among fashion historians after someone had discovered that several iconic avant-garde pieces from 1980's fashion exhibitions were credited to M. Beaumont, the same name as the craft store employee who had become legendary among local seamstresses for her encyclopedic knowledge of textiles and construction techniques that seemed to come from professional couture training. Margot's story had begun in the revolutionary world of 1980s fashion when young designers believed they could challenge every assumption about clothing, beauty, and self-expression through radical new approaches to garment construction and aesthetic philosophy. Born in Lyon to parents who worked in textile manufacturing, Margot had shown exceptional artistic ability and understanding of fabric behavior from childhood, earning admission to the prestigious École de la Chambre Syndicale de la Couture Parisienne, and training undermasters who taught her that fashion was not just about clothing, it was about creating wearable sculptures that expressed ideas about identity, society, and the human experience. After graduating in 1982, Margot had established herself in the underground fashion scene of Paris and London, creating collections that combined traditional couture techniques with experimental materials and unconventional silhouettes that challenged conventional ideas about how clothes should look and function. Her work had been intellectual, artistic, and often unwearable in any practical sense, but it had pushed the boundaries of what fashion could express. Over 12 years, Margot Beaumont had become one of the most respected figures in avant-garde fashion. She'd shown collections at Paris Fashion Week that had been praised by critics as revolutionary, created pieces that were acquired by fashion museums as examples of late 20th century design innovation, and influenced a generation of designers who studied her techniques for transforming unconventional materials into garments that were both structurally sound and conceptually challenging. But the fashion industry had proven resistant to designers whose work prioritized artistic expression over commercial viability. Despite critical acclaim and museum exhibitions, Margot had struggled to find manufacturers willing to produce her designs for retail sale, investors willing to fund collections that might not sell, or retailers willing to stock pieces that challenged customers' expectations about wearable clothing. About 1999, after years of financial instability, she had been forced to close her atelier and abandon her fashion career. The craft store job had been taken in 2000 as temporary work while Margot figured out how to continue working with textiles and design, but 25 years later, she discovered unexpected satisfaction in helping amateur sewers understand fabric behavior, construction techniques, and design principles that could elevate their home projects from crafts to art. The Tonight Show tickets had been a surprise retirement gift from Creative Corner Crafts management and loyal customers who had recognized that Margot's guidance had transformed their sewing abilities and wanted to honor the woman who had somehow made every craft project feel like a master class in textile arts. It was a Friday night taping in June, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing a costume designer about her work on a new period drama. During his commercial break interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Margot by her sophisticated aesthetic sense and the way she examined fabrics and textures with obvious professional expertise. Man, you have an incredible eye for fabric and design. Are you in the fashion industry? Margot straightened with the practiced poise of someone who had spent decades presenting avant-garde concepts to fashion critics and museum curators. Craft store employee, sir. Creative Corner Crafts here in Manhattan. Been helping customers with sewing and fabric projects for 25 years. A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. Craft stores were essential resources for creative hobbyists, and 25 years of helping people with their projects deserved recognition. 25 years helping people with crafts? You must have incredible knowledge about textiles and construction. Margot's face lit up with genuine passion for fabric and design. Every material has its own personality, how it drapes, how it responds to different construction techniques, how it ages and moves with the body. Understanding these qualities is essential, whether you're making a simple tote bag or more complex garment. You talk about fabric behavior like someone with serious technical training, very sophisticated understanding of textile science. Well, creating beautiful, functional pieces requires understanding how materials work, how construction techniques affect the final result. Whether you're working on a home sewing project or professional garment construction, the principles remain the same. Jimmy noticed something in Margot's language, a technical sophistication about fashion construction that suggested experience beyond typical craft store work. Margot, have you always worked in craft retail? You seem to have professional training in fashion or textile design. Margot paused as if deciding how much of her background to reveal. Actually, I used to work in fashion design before I started at the craft store. Avant-garde fashion, experimental garments, that type of work. But that was a very different world. The mention of avant-garde fashion design caught the audience's attention immediately. Experimental fashion was associated with high art, museum exhibitions, and the most cutting-edge aspects of the industry. You designed avant-garde fashion, Margot? That's serious artistic work. Where did you show your collections? Paris Fashion Week, primarily, some shows in London and New York. I focused on experimental construction techniques, unconventional materials, garments that explored the boundary between clothing and sculpture. Jimmy's curiosity was immediately piqued. Fashion Week in Paris was the pinnacle of the industry, and avant-garde work suggested artistic vision that went far beyond commercial fashion, and someone with that background working at a craft store suggested a compelling story. Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. Margot, Paris Fashion Week is the highest level of fashion artistry. Would you mind coming down here and telling us about your design career? Margot looked uncertain. Oh, I don't think people want to hear about experimental fashion stories. That work was very conceptual, probably not interesting for general audiences. Trust me, people definitely want to hear about fashion design from someone who showed at Paris Fashion Week. Come on down. As Margot made her way to the stage with the graceful movement of someone who had once walked backstage at fashion shows where every detail mattered, her bearing transformed completely, the confident presence of someone who had once created garments that redefined what clothing could be and mean. When she reached the stage, Jimmy guided her to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, this is Margot Beaumont. For 25 years, she's been helping customers at Creative Corner Crafts with their sewing projects. But before that, she was an avant-garde fashion designer who showed collections at Paris Fashion Week. Margot, tell us about your fashion career. Margot settled into the chair, and when she spoke about fashion design, her voice took on the passion and intellectual depth of someone who had approached clothing as a medium for artistic expression. Avant-garde fashion is about questioning assumptions. Why do clothes have to follow certain silhouettes, use traditional materials, serve only practical functions? My work explored how garments could express ideas about identity, social structures, the relationship between the body and the constructed environment. The audience was completely quiet, understanding they were hearing about fashion as high art from someone who had practiced it at the most sophisticated levels. What made your designs avant-garde? Margot's eyes lit up with memories of creative challenges that had pushed the boundaries of what clothing could be. I worked with unconventional materials, metal mesh, paper composites, recycled plastics, and developed construction techniques that allowed these materials to move with the body. One collection used fabric that changed color based on the wearer's body temperature, creating garments that literally reflected emotional states. This sounds incredibly innovative. How do you make fabric change color? Thermochromic fibers embedded in specially developed textiles. We worked with material scientists to create fabrics that responded to physical and environmental changes. The garments became living interfaces between the wearer and their surroundings. Billy reached behind his chair and pulled out a tablet loaded with fashion history databases and museum archives. Margot, we did some research before tonight's show. He showed Margot archived fashion photographs and exhibition catalogs. According to fashion museum records, Margot Beaumont's collections were featured in major exhibitions and acquired by museums as examples of late 20th century design innovation. Margot looked stunned. You found my fashion work? We did. Listen to this from a 1989 Vogue review. Beaumont's vision transcends fashion to become wearable art that challenges every assumption about the relationship between clothing and identity. Her technical innovation and conceptual depth place her among the most important designers of her generation. The studio fell completely silent. The audience was processing that they were meeting someone whose fashion work had been recognized as museum quality art. Margot, your work was clearly groundbreaking and influential. What happened? Why did you leave fashion design? Margot's expression grew more reflective, touching on the economic realities that affected artistic fashion. Avant-garde fashion is incredibly difficult to commercialize. My pieces were acquired by museums and collectors, but they couldn't be mass-produced or sold through traditional retail. Despite critical success, there was no sustainable business model for that type of experimental work. I think must have been incredibly frustrating after achieving such artistic recognition. It was heartbreaking. I'd found my artistic voice and critical validation, but I couldn't find a way to continue creating that work financially. The fashion industry rewards commercial viability, not necessarily artistic innovation. Jimmy leaned forward. But you never stopped being a designer, did you? Margot smiled for the first time since taking the stage. Design thinking never leaves you. At the craft store, I help customers understand how to manipulate fabric, how to problem solve construction challenges, how to achieve their creative vision using available materials. It's still design, just applied to different projects. Jimmy continued reading from the tablet. Margot, we found something else. Several fashion museums and contemporary designers have been trying to locate you for exhibition projects and collaboration opportunities. Fashion museums want to work with me. Listen to this from the curator of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum. Margot Beaumont's work represents a crucial period in fashion history when designers were exploring the artistic possibilities of clothing. Her techniques and conceptual approach would be invaluable for current exhibitions about fashion as art. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman spent 12 years creating revolutionary fashion art that influenced how the world understood clothing as creative expression, then spent 25 years sharing that expertise with anyone who wanted to learn about fabric and design. He turned back to Margot. The fashion world wants to honor you. The Council of Fashion Designers of America wants to give you their Lifetime Achievement Award, and several major fashion schools want to offer you teaching positions in experimental design. Margot's eyes filled with tears. They want to honor my fashion work. Well, they do. And Margot, there's something else. Young designers are studying your experimental techniques and citing your work as inspiration for sustainable and innovative fashion approaches. Jimmy had one more surprise. We have someone here who wanted to meet you. From backstage, Iris Van Herpen, one of today's most celebrated avant-garde fashion designers known for her innovative 3D printed couture, appeared carrying a portfolio of her latest experimental garments. Margot, Van Herpen said, approaching with obvious respect. I've been studying your work since fashion school. Your exploration of unconventional materials and experimental construction techniques pioneered the path that designers like me continue to follow. You proved that fashion could be both technically innovative and conceptually profound. Margot was openly crying now, overwhelmed by recognition from one of fashion's current avant-garde leaders. You know my design work? Every serious experimental designer knows Margot Beaumont. Your techniques for working with non-traditional materials and your conceptual approach to garment construction are still referenced in contemporary fashion education. You were decades ahead of your time in understanding fashion as wearable technology. Jimmy sat back down beside Margot. Margot, you've spent 25 years thinking your fashion career was history. But what you really did was continue practicing design innovation while your experimental techniques continued influencing how fashion artists approached their craft. As they helped Margot back to her seat, she stopped and looked out at the audience one more time. Thank you for honoring my work, but I want creative people to know innovation doesn't require expensive materials or famous platforms. Whether you're creating avant-garde fashion or helping someone make their first dress, the goal is the same: understanding materials, solving construction challenges, and bringing creative visions to life with skill and imagination. The episode that aired became one of the most inspiring Tonight Show segments ever, sparking conversations about artistic careers and the designers who continued practicing their craft regardless of commercial success. Margot's story inspired several fashion museums to actively seek out former avant-garde designers for archival and exhibition projects, recognizing that their experimental knowledge was irreplaceable as fashion history. Her craft store became an informal fashion school where she taught customers advanced construction techniques using everyday materials. Margot spent her retirement consulting on fashion exhibitions and teaching experimental design techniques while continuing to work at the craft store part-time, discovering that leaving commercial fashion hadn't ended her artistic contribution. It had democratized her expertise to serve anyone who wanted to understand the art and science of creating beautiful functional objects from fabric. At 68, Margot still approaches every fabric with a designer's creative eye, still believes that everyone has the potential to create beautiful things, and still carries her fashion portfolio alongside her craft store badge, a reminder that true artists never stop innovating. They just find new communities where their knowledge can inspire others to push the boundaries of what's possible, one carefully constructed scene at a time. Because sometimes the most important fashion happens not on runways or in magazines, but in ordinary places where former designers continue proving that creativity and technical excellence are not privileges reserved for the famous. They're skills that can transform anyone's relationship with materials, construction, and the ancient human art of making beautiful things that serve both practical and aesthetic needs.